Okay, now for some criticisms of the kinds of solutions to market failure that have been put forward so far. First, we'll look at the criticism of Pigouvian solutions. This is taxes on negative externalities and subsidies for positive externalities. The first obvious difficulty is that sometimes it's hard for governments to know what all the costs and benefits are. If we take the example of negative externalities, there's an incentive on the part of bystanders to exaggerate the effects of positive or negative externalities, and there's an incentive on the part of culprits to understate the effects of negative externalities. In the case of positive externalities, there's an incentive on the part of private providers who might be receiving a subsidy to exaggerate their private marginal costs, because the higher the reported marginal costs of production are, the larger the subsidy the providers will receive from the government. This is actually a problem that conceivably arises, or has in the past arisen, in the tertiary education sector, where the government has provided subsidies to private colleges of various kinds who overstate their costs in order to receive large subsidies from the government. Another problem is that it's difficult to forecast future externalities. So, leaving aside the question of estimating the costs and or the benefits of externalities now, there's the further problem of externalities into the future. Obviously, if externalities, negative externalities, for example, are overestimated, then taxes that would be imposed, that are to flow on into the future, would be similarly overestimated, and so there could be an overtaxing of quote-unquote culprits. Or if the externalities into the future are positive, there could be under-subsidizing, so there could be insufficient resources devoted to industries which generate positive externalities into the future, simply because it's difficult to know exactly what the future holds. And finally, there's always the difficulty of giving monetary estimates to some kinds of costs and benefits. So, for example, estimating the benefits of saving a human life, it has to be estimated in monetary terms in order to make comparisons with other benefits and other costs that exist. There's also the difficulty, how do you provide a monetary estimate to cultural diversity? So are we going to allow in the case of climate change, for example, if we allowed climate change to continue, then there'll be some small islands with small, unique cultural, unique cultures which will be wiped out by rising sea levels. How much is that worth? I mean, what would be the benefit of saving it in monetary terms? How do we express that? And in the case of biodiversity, how do we estimate the costs of losing biodiversity or the benefits of maintaining them? It's obvious in the case of, well, not so much obvious, but easy to understand in the case of warm and cuddly creatures like koala bears or panda bears or, grizzly bears. Well, maybe not grizzly bears, they're godless killing machines, but other kinds of cuddly creatures. That's easy to think about, perhaps, or easier to think about the value of those types of creatures. But what about other creatures that maintain the biodiversity of an entire ecosystem, such as creepy crawly bugs that live under the soil that no one really likes, that has no aesthetic value, and everyone would spray with fly spray if they were given half the chance, but nonetheless are essential for the ecosystem? How do we value those kinds of creatures? Obviously, it's difficult to understand or to figure out how we would go about doing that in order to correctly provide taxes and or subsidies to eliminate the external effects of market behaviour. Another criticism that's sometimes levelled at Pigovian tax solutions or subsidy solutions is the issue of bureaucratic self-interest. Some public service department heads have their own particular goals. Their goals are not necessarily those that are specified for them in statutes or as in mission directives provided by governments, but they might have their own personal agendas. And one of those might be to maximise their budgets in order to enhance their status and power within a bureaucracy. That will sometimes might involve overstating various externalities which they are in charge of regulating or seeking to abate, and thereby gaining greater departmental budgets to deal with larger externalities. There's also the question of growing citizens' demand, and this particularly applies to public goods. Public goods tend to be income elastic for most citizens. That is to say, as for most citizens, when their incomes rise by some percentage, their demand, their willingness to pay for certain public goods increases by more than that percentage. So, for example, as a citizenry becomes richer, they tend to want more national defence, more public parks and amenities, more high-quality infrastructure, better education, a better quality justice system. All of these things are, in some way or other, public goods or quasi-public goods, and therefore need to be paid for by the state through taxation. Now, the problem here is that this can result in fiscal problems for the government if at the same time citizens are averse to paying higher taxes. So they might want more public services or more public goods provided, more expenditure on public goods, but are not willing to pay the higher taxes required to fund them. And this is especially the case, with respect to taxes at least, for the super rich, for whom public goods tend to become inferior goods. That is, at some point when a certain class of people become very, very rich, as their incomes rise, they decrease their demand for public goods. They're less interested in national defence and a good quality functioning justice system and more public parks and amenities, more high quality public infrastructure and public schools and public hospitals and so on, because they can afford to buy their own high quality private versions of those things. So you'll find that often the super rich won't they won't call the police, they'll have their own private security. They don't send their kids to public schools, they send their kids to private schools. They don't use public roads, rather they fly around in helicopters, and so on. With respect to the Coasian solution to externalities, you'll recall that was a case of assigning clearly defined property rights over a previously common resource. The problem here, the chief problem here, and this is a problem that was identified by Ronald Coase himself, is transaction costs. Transaction costs might be higher than anyone is willing to pay. Say, for example, if we said that a factory had to pay by, say, for example, emissions. They would have to buy emissions tickets in order to pollute the air. If, in order to do that, they had to engage in substantial legal wrangling and fill out a lot of contracts that are higher in price than the actual pollution tickets themselves, then they might not be willing to purchase the pollution tickets in the first place. So in that case, where transaction costs are high, the transactions which facilitate the internalization of externalities wouldn't occur. And as I said there, the classic example of transaction costs is legal fees. But there can also be transaction costs associated with lost time due to haggling over what the price of the rights on offer should be, because there might be uncertainty on the part of the players who are haggling over the rights. There might be uncertainty about what that price is, or what the highest price one party is willing to pay, what's the lowest price the other party is willing to accept, and so on. Another problem is that there might be many participants. So, for example, if we had a factory which is billowing out pollution onto the suburb around them, the thousands of households around them, we can't seriously expect to institute a private property solution to this, in which the factory has to negotiate with each individual household to decide on how much money each household would be willing to accept in exchange for allowing the factory to pollute the air. It just becomes too costly when there are too many participants at work. And finally, of course, there's enforcement costs to the society. If we exchange property rights, then obviously we have to ensure that those property rights, what's entailed by those property rights, is enforced by the law. And that can itself be very expensive. Another problem related to the coast solution is a curious phenomenon which has been discovered in the last 20 years or so, 25 years or so, and that's something called the endowment effect. The endowment effect means that that I value something more if I own it than if I don't. And you might say, well, that seems pretty obvious, but as far as an economist is concerned, when we're thinking purely rationally and in an impersonal way about the value of goods, it shouldn't matter whether we own the thing or not in determining how much benefit we do or would get from it. Whether I own a Mars bar or not, I'm going to get a certain amount of happiness from it if I consume it, or if I could consume it. And therefore, I presumably would value it by the same amount, whether I actually possessed it or not. Right? In other words, I'd be willing to pay, say, $3 for a Mars bar. And I would be therefore willing to be compensated $3 if I lost the Mars bar. But in fact, people don't seem to think like that. If I have the Mars bar in my possession and I regard it as mine, for some reason I think the Mars bar is now worth $5. Whereas if I had to purchase the Mars bar, I think it's only worth $3, which seems odd and somewhat irrational, but nonetheless, we call this an endowment effect. Now, in the case of the private property rights solution from Coase, it means that depending on who has been allocated the property rights over a previously common resource, it can affect the value that the person who is granted those property rights gives to that thing. So if, for example, there's me versus a factory for a river or a rainforest, and the government allocates to me the rights over the rainforest, by virtue of the fact that I come to own the rainforest and I regard it as mine, I might say, as compensation, if the factory were to want to pollute and ruin this rainforest, as compensation, I would want $100 million. Whereas, if, on the other hand, the factory was given the rights to utilize the rainforest, and I didn't have rights over them, I don't feel like I own the rainforest, then I might say, well, I would only be willing to pay $50 million to stop the factory from polluting the rainforest. When if I was totally dispassionate about it, I should either want compensation of, say, $100 million, or if I valued saving the rainforest, I should be willing to pay $100 million. But that's not how it works. So it depends on, psychologically, that's not how it works, apparently. So whoever is allocated the property rights will value the product more than they would have if they hadn't been given the property rights. And this seems like we get an odd kind of situation, because it can then affect the ultimate outcome of a trade, or a potential trade, between two parties that are in dispute over a common resource, which is something not really contemplated by Coase. And finally, the Coasean property rights solution doesn't really deal well with public goods, such as, so this is goods which are non-excludable and non-diminishable. So, for example, if we talked about the justice system, we would say that no one can be excluded, no citizen can be excluded from the Australian justice system. That's the nature of the justice system. If you can be excluded from it, it's not really a justice system. If you have to pay to get access to justice, it's not really justice. And it shouldn't be diminishable. That is, as more people gain the protection of the law, it doesn't somehow diminish the law. But in a privatized justice system, that wouldn't necessarily be true at all. In a privatized justice system, you might have to pay to get access to justice. And in that case, we might say it's not a true justice system or a genuine justice system. Because everyone should be equal before the law, not everyone is, equal if and only if they pay. When we come to direct controls, the most obvious and the simplest problem with a direct control approach is that it doesn't really provide the incentive to improve beyond the set regulatory requirements. If for example, if an industry is allowed to pollute up to a certain amount, and produce up to a certain amount and pollute up to a certain amount, and that's set in law, that's a cap placed on the amount of pollution that's possible, well, firms can pollute up to that amount. What's the incentive to pollute less? Well, there's no incentive to pollute less. Arguably, if you had something like a tax on pollution, there's conceivably in the long run an incentive to engage in some research and development, assuming it's not hideously expensive, engage in some research and development to come up with a kind of technology which enables you to avoid polluting when you produce the product. If you can avoid polluting while producing the product at the same time, you don't have to pay the tax. So there's a kind of a long-run incentive built into a pollution tax, for example. But that's not the case if there's simply direct controls imposed. So it provides far less flexibility of action to agents than other measures that could be utilized. When we come to the criticism of the merit goods solutions, now remember, merit goods are goods that are regarded as meritorious, and there are other bads, as opposed to goods, which are demeritorious, and they are regarded as such irrespective of the preferences or beliefs of particular consumers. The criticism here is that, and this is where there's usually direct controls imposed by governments, so prohibitions on certain kinds of behaviour or purchasing certain kinds of goods, or requirements that you must purchase certain kinds of goods. All of the criticisms we've seen above could apply to merit or demerit goods, but there's a couple of other criticisms which are kind of politically tinged in some way. So one of them is when we have to ask the question, well, if what counts as beneficial is a subjective matter, then who decides that some preferences are wrong or ill-formed preferences? So at the present time, people regard, or it's widely regarded as a bad thing to consume methamphetamines, and everyone seems to be fine with that as a general idea. But what if we said, well, eating Mars bars is undesirable or wrong? If I think Mars bars are beneficial to me, then why would we classify that as something that's wrong? And who decides that anyway? Normally, of course, we would say that's decided by a government. Now, if the government is a democratically elected government, then we might say, well, then it's determined ultimately by the will of the population through popular vote for democratically elected representatives who then go on to act in our interests. But of course we know that that political system could be a little bit corrupt, or the elected representatives may act in what they think is our interest, but instead of doing exactly what we want. After all, our elected representatives are representatives of our interests. They are not our delegates. They are not simply mouthpieces through which we speak. And the further criticism that follows from this is that you can get a creeping paternalism. That is, the state or the government starts to act like a parent who is constantly looking over the shoulder of its citizens and telling them to do this and don't do that because we have deemed it to be good for you, irrespective of what you think is good for you. And that can be, is regarded by some people as is an undesirable infringement on their freedoms, which can ultimately lead to an evil totalitarian society or some other nonsense like